My name is Nora Calloway, 28 years old. I want to start by telling you about the third row. Not the first row, where my maid of honor Penny was ugly crying into a handkerchief she had borrowed from Daniel's uncle. Not the second row, where Daniel's mother Dorothy sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes closed like she was saying a private prayer she had been saving up for 30 years. I want to tell you about the third row, where my parents sat on the bride's side of the aisle with the stiff, careful posture of two people who had not expected to be there, who had not expected any of this, the flowers, the candlelight, the 200 people gathered in a barn-turned venue on the edge of a Tennessee valley, and their daughter standing at the altar in a dress she had found in a consignment shop and altered herself, marrying a man who, at that very moment, was reading from a folded piece of paper the story of how he had fallen in love with her. With me. My mother sat with her ankles crossed and her handbag on her lap. My father sat with his arms folded, one leg crossed over the other. They looked uncomfortable, which was a look I knew well on both of their faces because I had spent 22 years making them uncomfortable simply by existing. But they were there. They were in that room. And when Daniel looked up from his paper and his voice broke open on a single sentence, when he said the words that made 200 people stop breathing at the same time, I watched my mother's handbag slide off her lap and fall to the floor, and I watched my father unfold his arms, and I watched both of them, for the very first time in my entire life, look at me like they had made a mistake. I want you to understand what that moment cost to get to. I want you to understand every single thing that had to happen before a woman like me could stand at an altar in a consignment shop dress and let herself be loved out loud, in front of everyone, without flinching. So I'm going to tell you all of it, from the very beginning, because it didn't start at the wedding. It didn't even start when I met Daniel. It started the afternoon I was 7 years old and spilled a glass of orange juice on the kitchen floor, and my mother looked at me with an expression I would spend the next 21 years trying to understand, and said, in a voice so calm it was almost kind, "You are the kind of person who will always make a mess of things, Nora. And one day you will find out that nobody wants to clean up after you forever." That was the beginning. My parents' names are Beverly and Howard Calloway, and I think it's important that you know before I tell you anything else about them that they were not monsters in the way that the word monster is usually used. They did not beat me. They did not lock me in closets. There were no dramatic acts of cruelty that I could point to at a dinner table and have people gasp. What they did was quieter than that, and in many ways, because of its quietness, it was harder to name. It was harder to recover from, because when someone does something loud and terrible to you, you can call it loud and terrible. But when someone does something quiet and persistent, when they dismantle you in small increments over the course of a childhood, you grow up thinking it's just the weather. You grow up thinking this is just what the air smells like. Beverly Calloway was the daughter of a woman who had been told she was too much and not enough simultaneously, which is the specific and particular inheritance of women in certain families, passed down like silverware or a bad back. My grandmother, whom I knew only through photographs and a single Christmas visit when I was 4, had apparently been a difficult woman, which, as I came to understand much later in life, was the word that women who wanted things were given in families that didn't believe women should want things. Beverly had grown up absorbing that word like a dye. She had become the opposite of difficult. She had become very still, very controlled, very tidy, and she had married Howard Calloway because he was the kind of man who would never describe her as too much, because Howard Calloway did not believe that any person was worth that level of attention. Howard was an accountant. He had the disposition of someone who had decided very early in life that emotions were a form of financial irresponsibility, something you could not afford and would ultimately lose money on. He was not cruel in the obvious way. He just wasn't there, even when he was standing right in front of you. He would look at you and his eyes would sort of skim over you, the way eyes skim over the fine print at the bottom of a contract you've already decided to sign. He was present in the house in the way that furniture is present in a house. You noticed the space he took up, but you never felt particularly warmed by it. They had me when my mother was 29, which was later than she had planned, because the years before me had involved 2 miscarriages that were never spoken of above a whisper, 2 small losses that had curdled inside my mother into something she couldn't name and so named instead as disappointment. I was not a disappointment in the traditional sense. I was healthy. I was, apparently, a beautiful baby, though I only know this because a neighbor said so in a photograph caption someone wrote in an album I found once at the back of a closet. My mother never said I was a beautiful baby. My mother was not a woman who said things like that, and I spent a long time believing that was simply her nature, and an even longer time understanding that her nature had been built by someone else's hands. What I was as a child was loud, bright, messy with feeling the way children are when nobody has taught them yet to tidy themselves up. I laughed too hard, I cried too hard, I asked too many questions, I wanted to touch everything. I once spent an entire afternoon collecting earthworms from the backyard and arranging them in patterns on the porch, because I had read that they were important for soil, and I wanted to thank them somehow, which was the kind of thing I did as a child, the kind of thing that made my mother sigh and go inside and close the door. I was not, to use her word, sensible. I was not, to use my father's glance, the kind of child that made sense. There were never any big speeches. No one sat me down and told me I was unlovable in a single defining moment. It happened instead in the accumulation of 1,000 small corrections. Don't be so dramatic, Nora. Calm down, Nora. Nobody likes a child who always needs something. Stop performing, Nora. You don't have to make everything into a scene. Did you see how the Henderson girl never makes a fuss? That's how people like people, Nora. That's how you get people to want to be around you, by not needing so much. By not needing so much. I was 9 years old the first time I remember physically feeling the sentence settle into my body like weather. We were at a school play. I had the second largest role, which was not the largest role but was not small, and I had practiced my lines until I could say them in my sleep. And when I walked off the stage, I was shaking with the particular electricity of having done something that had felt real and alive, and connected to something in me that was always searching for a place to stand. I found my parents in the crowd. My mother was putting her coat on. My father was looking at his phone. "Did you see me?" I asked. "We saw you," my mother said, and she said it the way you'd say we heard the alarm, acknowledging a thing that had happened, not commenting on whether the thing was good. "Did I do okay?" My father looked up from his phone. "You were fine, Nora." Fine, the word that means nothing happened here, the word that means we are not going to give this any more oxygen than it has already taken. I cried in the back seat of the car on the way home, quietly, the way I had learned to cry so they wouldn't hear me and tell me I was being dramatic. And somewhere in the dark of the back seat, with the lights of passing street lamps crossing my face in intervals, I started the very long process of deciding that the problem was me, that I was too much and not enough simultaneously, that the reason no one seemed to want to be in the warmth of what I felt was that my warmth was the wrong kind. Too bright, too needy, too loud. That was the story I wrote about myself at 9 years old, and it is extraordinary, when I look back on it now, how long I carried it. Middle school is its own particular chamber of horrors, even for children who have had parents who loved them cleanly and without reservation, so I will not dwell too long in those years, except to tell you the parts that matter for everything that came after. I was not the girl who got picked on savagely. I was the girl who was adjacent to invisibility, present enough to be occasionally reminded of my presence, absent enough that nobody bothered to really learn my name. I had 2 friends, Penny Hartwell, who has already appeared in this story and will remain in it until the very end, and a girl named Delphine who moved to Ohio in 8th grade and who I still think about sometimes with a fondness that has no particular reason. Penny Hartwell deserves a paragraph all to herself, because Penny Hartwell is the reason for several of the most important things in my life, including the fact that I am alive to write this. Penny was the kind of person who had been assembled by the universe specifically to counteract people like my parents. She was small, she is still small, 5 feet 2 in thick socks with a gap between her front teeth and hair that never agreed with any plan she made for it, and she loved with the kind of specificity that most people reserve for things they are afraid to lose. She noticed things. When I was quiet, she noticed. When I was performing okayness, she noticed. She never called me on it loudly, the way some friends do, making a performance of their own perception. She would just sit next to me and hand me half of her sandwich and say, without any fanfare, "You don't have to be fine if you're not fine." And then she would wait. I did not, for a long time, know how to accept that. It was so different from the air I breathed at home. I remember the first time she said it, when we were 11, sitting on the bleachers after a PE class. I had failed somewhat spectacularly, and I looked at her like she had said something in a language I was still learning the alphabet of. "What do you mean?" I said. "I mean," she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has been told very different things than I had been told, "that sometimes things are hard, and that's just true, and you don't have to pretend it's not. I ate half her sandwich and said nothing, but I felt something move in me very slowly like a ship turning in a narrow channel, something that said, "Oh, so that's possible." I held on to that for a long time. At home, things had not changed. If anything, my parents' particular variety of neglect had become more specific as I became older and more capable of triggering it by simply having opinions. I was 13 when I told my parents I wanted to be a writer, and I watched my father's expression do a thing I recognized, not contempt exactly, but a kind of flat deflation, the way a balloon looks when you've barely pressed it and it's already going soft. "Writers don't make money, Nora," he said. "Some of them do," I said. "The ones that do are extraordinary people," my mother said, and she said it gently, and I understood because I had become fluent in the language of gentleness used as a weapon, that she was not paying me a compliment. She was telling me I was not extraordinary. She was telling me with great kindness that the category of people who succeeded at things that required a particular kind of fire was a category that did not include me. "I think Nora could be a good writer," Penny said once, when she overheard some version of this conversation at our kitchen table. My mother smiled at Penny in the specific way that adults smile at children who have said something sweet and wrong. "You're a good friend," she said. Which was not the same as saying Penny was right. I was 15 when I started keeping a journal, which sounds unremarkable until I tell you that the journal became the first place in my life where I existed without apology. I wrote everything in it. The big dramatic feelings I had been told were too much. The observations about people and the world that came to me so fast sometimes I had to write them down just to keep from drowning in them. The stories I made up about characters who had parents who looked at them and saw something worth seeing. I filled 4 notebooks in a year. I hid them in a box under my bed, and I want to tell you with no drama that those notebooks were the beginning of my survival. I wrote stories in the journals that were the opposite of my life, stories where the parents looked at their daughter and saw something whole and good and worth the trouble of knowing. I wrote characters who cried too hard and laughed too hard and collected earthworms and filled notebooks, and the people in those stories loved them for it, not despite it. I was not a naive child. I knew I was writing wish fulfillment. But I also knew, with the instinct of someone who would spend her adult life trying to understand what stories are for, that writing the thing you need is not the same as pretending it exists. Writing the thing you need is a way of keeping the flame alive, a way of saying, this is possible, this has a shape, I know its shape because I drew it. I also wrote in those journals some of the most furious sentences I have ever produced, about the car, about the turn signal, about being asked to be smaller than I was in every space that should have been safe enough to be large in. I wrote things I never would have said out loud, and the writing absorbed them, and I survived, and the journals eventually became the architecture of my fiction, the deep aquifer that everything good I would later write was drawing from whether or not I knew it. I should also tell you about Mrs. Aldridge, because she was there during that period, and she matters in a way that I didn't understand until years later. Mrs. Aldridge was our next-door neighbor from the time I was 6 until I was 14, when she moved to be closer to her daughter in another state. She was 60-something, widowed, with a garden she tended with the devotion that some people reserve for churches, and she had white hair she kept in a braid and a laugh that was 2 decibels louder than anything else in her vicinity. She liked me. She liked me in the uncomplicated, unqualified way that certain adults like certain children, not because I was exceptional or because I reminded her of someone, but simply because she had looked at me and decided that I was a person worth liking. She would call me over the fence when I was in the backyard and show me whatever was growing in her garden that week, explaining the names of things with the seriousness of someone imparting classified information. She let me read in her sunroom on Saturday afternoons. She made me tea from bags she kept in a tin with a picture of a ship on it, and she told me about her husband and her daughter and the city she had grown up in, and she listened when I talked about school the way I always wanted adults to listen, as though what I was saying was inherently worth hearing, as opposed to being a thing she was enduring politely on the way to more adult conversation. "You have a very good head on your shoulders," she told me once when I was 10, and I had said something about a book we had both read. She said it with such matter-of-fact certainty, the way you'd say you have brown eyes, as simple and observable as a fact about the weather. I went home and said it to myself quietly in the bathroom mirror, "A very good head on your shoulders, Nora." I think about Mrs. Aldridge more than she would ever have imagined. I think she would be pleased to know that she was, for a period of several years in a child's life, a small and consistent counterweight to the thing happening inside the house next door. I think she would be pleased to know that she mattered, that the tea in the tin with the ship on it, and the Saturday afternoons and the matter-of-fact kindness of her had gone into the child and become part of the structure of the adult. I wish I had told her before she moved away that she was important. I didn't know then how to tell people that. It is something I have learned with great deliberateness in the years since. I was also 15 when I got the first, and I want to be precise here, the first outright and direct statement from my mother about my romantic prospects. We were in the car. I don't remember where we were going. I had been telling her about a boy in my class, a boy named Patrick who had smiled at me in the hallway in a way that had sent my 15-year-old heart into complete and total revolution. And I was telling her the way daughters sometimes tell their mothers things, quickly, warmly, with the unreasonable hope that the warmth would be received the way warmth is supposed to be received. She waited until I was finished. Then she said, "Don't get too attached to that, Nora." "To what?" "To the idea that a boy like that is going to choose you." I remember the quality of the silence after she said it. I remember the way the car's turn signal made its small, indifferent clicking sound. "What do you mean?" I said, though I knew what she meant. I just needed her to say it out loud, so that I could tell myself later that I had not imagined it. "I just mean," she said, adjusting her grip on the steering wheel, "that you're a particular kind of person, Nora. You're a lot to take on. And boys, young men want things to be easy. You've never been easy." I said nothing. "I'm not saying this to be unkind," she said, and I believe even now that she believed that. "I'm saying it because I want you to be realistic. I want you to protect yourself." What she did not say, and what I heard anyway, was, "I want you to protect yourself because no one else is going to." I was 15 years old and sitting in the passenger seat of my mother's car, and the sentence landed in me and grew roots, the way certain seeds do when they find exactly the right kind of darkness. The dark secret, when I learned it, did not come until much later, and I will get there. But I want to tell you about high school first, because high school is where I began the thing that would define me more than anything else, more than my writing, more than my years of quiet self-destruction, which was the thing where I was extraordinarily kind to other people while being extraordinarily cruel to myself. I don't know when it started exactly. Sometime around 16, I became the person who noticed things. Penny had taught me that maybe, or maybe it was always in me, and the notebooks had drawn it out. I noticed when the girl in my English class was having a terrible day and nobody else had noticed. I noticed when the boy who sat in front of me in chemistry had been wearing the same shirt 3 days in a row and was pretending not to be embarrassed about it. I noticed the lunch table with one person at it, and I brought my tray and sat down without making a thing of it, without performing the act of inclusion, just quietly being there. I was, by almost every external measure, a good person. I was thoughtful and perceptive, and I remembered what people told me and asked about it later, and people responded to this with a warmth that both fed me and confused me, because I could not reconcile the person they seemed to see with the person my parents described. The person my parents described was too much. The person people at school responded to was somehow exactly enough, and I spent years sitting with the contradiction, unable to solve it, defaulting always to the assumption that the people at school simply didn't know me well enough yet. That was the logic of it, you see. The logic that my parents had built without knowing they were building it was, the people who see you briefly think you're fine, but the people who really know you, we, your parents, the people who have been with you from the very beginning, we know the truth of you, and the truth is that you are not enough to keep. The truth is that love, real sustained love, the kind that doesn't leave, is not something you are built for receiving. I carried that logic for 11 years, from 15 to 26, and it shaped everything. It shaped the way I walked into rooms, always slightly sideways, like I was apologizing for taking up space. It shaped the way I accepted compliments, deflecting them immediately, batting them back like they were something I might hurt myself on if I held them too long. It shaped the way I entered relationships, which I did rarely and always with one foot already facing the door, already preparing for the moment the other person would look at me with the same flat deflation my father used and confirm what I already believed, that I was a beautiful girl in short distance and an exhausting reality up close. I want to tell you about 2 of those relationships before I tell you about Daniel, because they are part of the architecture of this story and I cannot skip them, even though part of me would like to. The first was a boy in college named Jordan, who was uncomplicated in the way that people are uncomplicated when they haven't had to think very hard about themselves yet. He was 20 and pre-law and handsome in a catalogue way, and he liked me genuinely with the uncomplicated affection of someone for whom love was a pleasant thing that happened to you rather than something you had to be brave enough to receive. We dated for 8 months. He was never unkind to me. But I was, without meaning to be, quietly catastrophic to us. I couldn't let him in. Every time he got close to something real in me, I would deflect or joke or redirect, and eventually, gently, apologetically, he told me that he felt like he was always on the outside of a door that I kept saying was open, but was actually very firmly closed. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, and he wasn't angry, which was almost worse. "I don't know how to give you what you need if you won't tell me what it is." "I don't need anything," I said. And he looked at me with a kind of sad recognition, the look of someone seeing exactly the problem, and said, "Yeah, I know you think that." We broke up 2 weeks later, and I told myself it was because he was not the right person, not because I was the wrong kind of person to be with anyone. But the sentence my mother had planted whispered that it had been right all along. The second relationship is harder to tell. His name was Philip. I was 23. I was in my first year of a master's program in creative writing, which I had gotten into on the strength of a short story collection that my thesis advisor from undergrad had called, in a letter of recommendation, quietly staggering, a phrase I read and reread so many times that the paper eventually softened at the crease. I had moved to a city 3 hours from where I grew up, which was the first time I had lived anywhere without the weight of my parents' house pressing on my ribcage, and I was, for the first time in my life, beginning to be something like okay. Penny had moved to the same city a year earlier for a job in graphic design, and we had the kind of friendship that can survive distance and then contract back into immediacy without any effort, and so I had a home base. I had the writing program. I had a studio apartment with a leaky faucet and a window that looked out onto a fire escape where a neighbor had left a pot of dead marigolds, and I loved that apartment with the specific devotion you have for the first place that is entirely and only yours. Philip taught a visiting craft lecture in my second semester. He was not my professor, important distinction, though I know how it sounds. He gave 3 lectures, and then stayed in the city for a residency at the literary organization that shared a building with my program, and we met at a reading and talked for 3 hours about the architecture of first-person narration, and he looked at me like I was saying things worth listening to, and I was, once again, 23 years old and undone by the sheer experience of being seen. He was 31. He was brilliant in the dazzling way, the kind of brilliant that sweeps you up in its current before you've noticed the water is moving. He had published 2 novels. He spoke 4 languages, one of them only partially, but he spoke the partial one with such confidence that nobody asked questions. He was the kind of man who moved through the world with the assurance that the world would accommodate itself to his presence, and because I had spent my entire life accommodating myself to the presence of others, there was something almost hypnotic about watching someone do the opposite. We were together for 2 years. I want to be careful here because this part of the story has edges, and I don't want to cut myself or you on them unnecessarily. What I will say is this: Philip was not a cruel person in the way that my parents were not cruel people. He was something more specific than cruel. He was a person who had found in me the ideal audience, someone perceptive enough to appreciate him, damaged enough not to require too much from him, trained from childhood to believe that the amount she was given was the correct amount, and that asking for more was a demonstration of the deficiency everyone had always suspected. He gave me just enough. That is the most precise way I can describe it. He was attentive in exactly the increments required to keep me grateful rather than comfortable. He praised my writing with the authority of someone whose praise meant something in our world, and I ate it up with the specific hunger of a person who had been on a very long fast. He told me I was talented. He told me I was beautiful. He told me these things with a sincerity I did not yet have the experience to locate as conditional. The condition, which I discovered 22 months into our relationship, was this: all of it, the attentiveness, the praise, the being seen, was available to me as long as I remained someone he could be the largest presence in. As long as I needed him more than he needed me. As long as I did not begin to believe, in any real and settled way, that I was someone worth loving without him as the arbiter of my worth. The day I found out is a day I can still walk through in my memory, like a room I know every corner of. I had been approached by a literary journal, a good one that Philip himself had been published in twice, about submitting a story. My advisor had put my name forward. The editor had reached out directly and asked if I had something she might look at. This was not extraordinary in the scope of the literary world, but it was extraordinary in the scope of my world, which had for so long been governed by the belief that I was not, to use my mother's word, extraordinary. I told Philip at dinner. I told him carefully, the way I always told him things that were about me, with a kind of preemptive dimming, making myself a little smaller in the telling so the news would not seem too large. I had learned to do this with him the way I had learned to do it at home. Keep the volume down, don't take up too much of the room. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did they say what specifically they were looking for?" "Just something I had," I said. "She said she'd read 2 of my pieces in workshop journals and she wanted to see more." Another moment of quiet. He poured more wine into his glass, not mine. "I'd be careful with Helena," he said. "Helena was the editor." "What do you mean?" "I just mean she has a very specific taste. She's not going to publish something just because she's intrigued by a new voice. She'll get your hopes up and then send a form rejection." He paused. "I'd hate for that to happen to you." I looked at him across the table. Something in me, something that Penny had tended for years, something that the notebooks had slowly built, said, "That is not what a person who is happy for you sounds like." But that something was still small and easily talked over, and I talked it over. "I'll just see what happens," I said. "Of course," he said and smiled, and changed the subject. 3 weeks later I submitted the story. Helena wrote back in 10 days and said she wanted to publish it and would I have more things she could see for future issues. I cried when I read the email. I was in my apartment, we did not live together. This was, I came to understand, another calculation, and I called Penny first, and she screamed so loudly I held the phone away from my ear and then screamed with her. Then I called Philip. He picked up on the 4th ring. "She's taking it," I said. There was a pause so small I almost missed it. "Well," he said, "that's great, Nora." And something in the well, the particular colour of the word, something shifted. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Of course," he said. "I'm happy for you. Listen, I'm in the middle of something, can I call you back?" He did not call me back that night. He texted 3 hours later, "Celebrating is in order, tomorrow." We went to dinner the next evening, and he was warm and attentive and present in exactly the way that made me distrust my own instincts, and I told myself I had imagined it. I told myself the pause was nothing. I told myself that I was, as always, looking for evidence of rejection, because rejection was the weather I had been trained to expect. I found out 4 days later, from a friend in the program, a woman named Vivienne who I liked, but who was also very specifically the kind of person who delivered information with the confidence of someone doing you a favor, that Philip had submitted a story to the same journal 8 months earlier and received a rejection. He had never told me this. That night I sat in my apartment with this fact and I turned it over and over like a stone in my hand, and then I did something I had never done in 2 years of being with him. I went back through our relationship looking not for the warmth, I had catalogued the warmth, I had lived in the warmth. The warmth was not the question, but for the other things, the small corrections, the pauses, the gentle, almost imperceptible redirections away from my own confidence, and toward the understanding that my confidence was always provisional, always dependent on his assessment. I found so many of them. I found the way he had described my writing to his friends, always with a qualifier. "Nora's got a real instinct, she just needs to develop it. Nora's interesting, you know, raw, still figuring out her voice. She has something, I think she does." The faint praise always present tense and conditional. The way he had twice submitted stories to competitions and not told me until after, once when he won, once when he didn't, both times without asking if I had something I wanted to enter. The way he had systematically, gently, and with complete plausible deniability kept me in the position of apprentice, student, person still becoming. Because as long as I was still becoming, I needed him. As long as I needed him, he was safe from the thing that actually frightened him, which was not me leaving but me arriving, me becoming, fully and without apology myself. The version of me that did not need him to tell her she was talented, because she already knew. The version who would look at him with clear eyes and see not a great man lending his light to a lesser one, but two people equal in a relationship where equality had never actually been on offer. I broke up with him on a Tuesday. I did it in his apartment, which I think was a mistake in retrospect, because it meant I had to get my coat and my bag and walk out a door, and the physicality of that, the coat, the bag, the door, made it feel very final in a way that I needed and couldn't fully feel at the same time. I told him I thought we wanted different things. I did not tell him what I had figured out, because I was still, at 25, not certain enough in my own perception to say it out loud to him without him making me doubt it. That was still his power, and I knew it. He said, "I think you're making a mistake." I said, "I know you do." And I walked out the door. I cried for approximately 2 blocks and then stopped, and the stopping surprised me. I had expected more. I had expected the specific devastation of finally confirming what I'd always believed, that I was not someone people chose to stay with. But walking down the sidewalk in the October air, I felt something different from devastation. I felt a strange, thin, fragile thing that I had almost no experience with. I felt like I had done something right. Before I tell you about the months after Philip, I want to finish the story of the publication because it matters. The story Helena published was called The Weather in Small Rooms, and it was about a woman who realizes, gradually and then all at once, that she has been confusing love with the absence of cruelty. It was autobiographical in the way that all fiction is autobiographical, not in the facts but in the truth underneath the facts. I had been writing it for 3 months before I understood what it was about, because the best stories reveal themselves to you as you write them rather than arriving fully formed, which is one of the reasons I have always believed that writing is more like listening than it is like speaking. You are trying to hear something that is already there. Helena called me the day after she accepted it, and we talked for 45 minutes, which is not a thing editors typically do when they accept a story from a new writer they have never met. She told me that she had read it twice before she knew what to say, and that she wanted to say carefully and specifically, "This is the real thing, not the almost real thing, not the potentially real thing, not the developing voice thing, the real thing." She asked me what I was working on, and I told her about the novel, and she said the words that I kept in my body for years afterward like a hand on my shoulder. "I want to read whatever you write." I hung up the phone and sat very still. Not because I was deflecting. For once I was not deflecting. I was sitting with it. I was letting the call have been the call it had been. I was practicing in my imperfect and unsteady way, believing it. The months after Philip were not easy, and I am not going to tell you they were, because this is a true story and true stories do not have the decency to skip the hard parts. I was 25, I had a publication I was proud of. I had Penny who had sat with me on my apartment floor the week after the breakup and eaten takeout noodles, and said with her characteristic lack of ceremony, "I never liked him. His hands were weird." I had my writing, which was becoming more mine than it had ever been. I had all of these things. And I also had the particular aftermath of a relationship that has spent 2 years reinforcing the story your parents began building at age 9. I had the quiet, settled, bone-deep belief that I was difficult and exhausting and too much, that the people who left were right to leave, that the people who stayed were either temporary or too kind to tell me the truth about themselves. I was 25, I had a publication I was proud of. I had Penny who had sat with me on my apartment floor the week after the breakup and eaten takeout noodles, and said with her characteristic lack of ceremony, "I never liked him. His hands were weird." I had my writing, which was becoming more mine than it had ever been. I had all of these things, and I also had the particular aftermath of a relationship that has spent 2 years reinforcing the story your parents began building at age 9. I had the quiet, settled, bone-deep belief that I was difficult and exhausting and too much, that the people who left were right to leave, that the people who stayed were either temporary or too kind to tell me the truth about themselves. I want to tell you about therapy, because I started it at 25 and I want to be explicit about this. It was the second most important thing that happened to me in my 20s after meeting Daniel, and I say this without embarrassment and without the residual sense that needing it means something is wrong with you, because one of the first things my therapist, whose name was Dr. Nina Okafor, and who had the specific superpower of asking exactly the question you were not ready for, told me was that needing help is not a failure of will or a sign of damage beyond repair. It is just the very reasonable result of being a person. I went to her every Thursday for 3 years. I want to give you a sense of what that looked like, because I think the cultural story of therapy is either dramatic, the breakthrough moment, the crying, the revelation that changes everything in a single session, or dismissive, the cooch, the and how does that make you feel, the endless circling without arrival. What it actually was for me was closer to what Daniel would later describe about restoration work. Slow and careful and full of places where you had to stop and look at what you were working with before you could decide what the next step was. In the first weeks, she asked me to describe my relationship with my parents. I did carefully with the precision of a person who has told a story many times and has smoothed its edges until it fits neatly in a telling. She listened. Then she asked, "When you describe them, you're very fair to them. You explain their reasons. You contextualize everything. What would it sound like if you described it without being fair?" I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what would you say about what happened to you if you weren't also managing how they sound?" The silence that came after that was one of the longest silences of my life. Because I realized I didn't know. I had been so thoroughly trained in the management of how things sounded, in the protection of the narrative that my parents had feelings too, that their actions had understandable origins, that I was complicit in my own experience in ways that made me responsible for how it had turned out. I had been so trained in all of this that I had never once simply said, plainly and without qualification, "This hurt me. This was wrong. What happened to me was not okay, and I did not deserve it." I did not say it that session. I was not ready. But the question sat with me for a week and then two, and eventually I came back and I said it, and it was one of the hardest sentences I have ever said, and it changed something. It changed something. I also, during this period, learned the dark secret. I want to be careful about how I tell this, because it involves people who are still alive and who have not given me permission to describe them. But it is necessary for the story, and so I will tell it as honestly and as carefully as I can. I learned it from my mother's sister, my Aunt Patricia, a woman I barely knew, who called me out of nowhere one February evening when I was 25 and alone in my apartment, and asked if I could talk. Patricia was 8 years older than my mother and had lived in another state for most of my life, and our relationship existed primarily in the form of birthday cards with $20 in them. I answered the call with the mild surprise of someone who has forgotten a phone number they gave out long ago and is startled when it rings. She asked how I was. I said fine, the way you say fine to family. She asked how the writing was going. I said well. There was a pause, the texture of which was not quite social, and then she said, "I want to tell you something about your parents, Nora. I want to tell you because I think it might help you understand some things, and because I think you've been carrying weight that was never supposed to be yours." What she told me was this. My parents had not originally wanted a child. They had, in fact, agreed before their marriage that they would not have children, that their life would be structured around a different kind of future. A future involving travel and financial independence, and the specific kind of comfortable solitude that two people can build when they are both, at their core, more in love with order than with the unpredictable chaos of loving someone new. They had been happy, by Patricia's account, in those first years. Constrained and quiet, and not very warm but genuinely, in their way, content. Then my father's parents had died within 6 months of each other, and something in him had shifted. The death of his parents had done to Howard Calloway what I think death sometimes does to people who have not been paying attention. It had made him suddenly, urgently aware of time. He had become, briefly, a different kind of person. He had wanted things. He had wanted, specifically, a child. He had believed, in the way that people believe things in grief without examining whether the belief is sound, that a child would give his life a weight and meaning that he could feel slipping away. My mother had not wanted this. My mother had been explicit about not wanting this. They had argued. My father had ultimately convinced her, not with coercion exactly, but with the slow, persistent pressure of someone who believes their need is a form of love and has not yet understood that it isn't. My mother had agreed, finally, out of the exhaustion that sometimes looks like love from the outside. I was born. I was not as a child what my father had been looking for. The child he had imagined, in the foggy, theoretical way people imagine children when they haven't had them yet, was a child who would complete something in him. A child who would anchor him to the world. A child who would be, in the simplest possible terms, an answer. And I was not an answer. I was a question, loud and perpetually unresolved, asking things he didn't know how to respond to, needing things he didn't know how to give. And so he had retreated, back into order and distance, and he had taken my mother with him. Or maybe she had been relieved to go. Maybe they had both in their way, been relieved to arrive at the explanation that the child was the problem. The child was too much, needed too much, would always need too much, because this explanation let them off the hook for something they did not want to examine. The guilt. Patricia used that word. She said, "Your parents feel guilty, Nora. They have felt guilty since before you were old enough to understand it. And I think they turned their guilt into something that sounds like advice, because it was easier to tell you the problem was you than to tell you the problem was something they had done." I sat with the phone against my ear for a very long time after she said that. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because," she said, "I saw you at Christmas 3 years ago, and you had a look on your face that I recognized because I saw it on your mother when she was young. It's the look of someone who has been told very precisely what they're worth and believed it. And I thought someone should tell you that the person who told you that was wrong, and that they were wrong for reasons that had nothing to do with you." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in the dark of my apartment for a while. I won't tell you it fixed everything because it didn't. Understanding where a wound came from does not close the wound. You still have to close it, and closing it takes time and work and a willingness to stand in the honest light of your own life without flinching. But it did something. It moved something. It loosened very slightly the specific knot of the belief that I was the origin of my own unlovability. I was 25. I had a long way to go. But I had moved an inch, and after a childhood of standing still, an inch felt like a mile. I should tell you about my writing here, because my writing is the thread that runs through everything, and I don't want you to miss it. By the time I was 26, I had published 11 short stories and the first section of what would eventually become a novel. I had won a small prize, nothing that would mean anything outside of the specific and insular world of literary fiction, but something that felt to me like being handed a stone to hold while you're trying not to drown. It was real. It was mine. It could not be qualified away. I was working a day job at a non-profit that did arts education in underfunded schools, which was the perfect job for me in the way that certain jobs are perfect for you, not because they are your dream, but because they are exactly aligned with the thing you are at your core. I went into classrooms of children who had been told, by circumstance if not by their parents, that creativity was a luxury they could not afford, that expression was something for other people, children with more time and more space and more of the world already on their side, and I handed them notebooks and pencils and I told them to write whatever they wanted. Whatever they wanted. Not what was right, not what was expected, not what would make sense to anyone else, just what was true. I told them once that the best writing is just telling the truth in the most accurate words you can find. A 12-year-old named Anthony looked at me and said, "But what if the truth is scary?" "Especially if the truth is scary," I said. "Especially then." He wrote me a story about his father that made me sit in my car afterward and cry for 20 minutes. He was the best writer in that class, and I told him so without qualifying it, without making it conditional on what he still needed to develop. And I watched him receive it the way I always watched children receive unqualified praise, with a stunned, almost painful openness, like a window being opened in a room that has been shut for too long. I thought about that a lot. The window, the room. I was trying in those years to open my own windows. It was slow. It required penny and therapy, which I started at 25 and which I can say without any embarrassment changed the architecture of my interior life in ways I am still discovering. And it required the writing, and it required the very specific daily work of choosing, again and again, to not confirm the story I had been given. I was, by 26, something I had never been before. I was not happy in the uncomplicated sense, because happiness is not uncomplicated, and I have never trusted people who describe themselves as simply happy, as if happiness were a single note and not an entire composition. But I was something. I was present in my own life in a way I hadn't been before. I was, tentatively and with great residual difficulty, beginning to believe that I was worth being around. That was the state of me when I met Daniel Ashworth. I need to tell you how I met him, because how I met him is the heart of the whole thing, and I want to get it exactly right. It was a Tuesday in March. I was 26 years old. I was in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the non-profit, the kind of coffee shop that is trying slightly too hard, with exposed brick and a chalkboard menu, and a person making oat milk into latte art with the focused expression of a surgeon. I had a stack of student writing I was trying to get through before a meeting at 2, and I had a coffee that was already cold, and I was in the specific fog of a person who has been inside their own head too long. There was a man at the table next to mine. He was reading. This is not a remarkable detail, except that he was one of those readers who reads with his entire body, leaning forward slightly, like he was trying to get closer to the page, occasionally moving his lips with a sentence he found particularly good, turning pages with the unhurried confidence of someone who has all the time in the world. I noticed him the way you notice things when you're a writer, and therefore a compulsive observer of human behavior, and then I went back to my student work. The thing that actually made me pay attention was when he laughed. Not loudly, just a brief, private laugh, the kind that escapes a person when something in a book is genuinely funny and they're surprised by it. The kind of laugh that is completely unself-conscious because he had no idea anyone was watching. It was a very good laugh. It was the laugh of someone who finds things genuinely funny and hasn't decided to edit the finding. I looked up. He was maybe 30. Brown hair that was slightly too long in a way that suggested not fashion, but rather that he had forgotten to get it cut. He had a face that was kind in the specific way faces are kind when the person has been practicing, not born into it but built into it by choices. He was wearing a jacket with a small tear at the left elbow that he had not noticed or did not care about, and he had a cup of tea, which struck me as notable in a coffee shop where everyone else was nursing cold brew. I looked back down at my work. 2 minutes later, the woman at the counter, a young woman whose name tag said B, dropped an entire tray of glass mugs. The sound was enormous and terrible. Every person in the coffee shop did the instinctive thing of looking, and then doing the second instinctive thing of immediately looking away, because we are a culture that has agreed that public accidents should be witnessed, and then immediately unwitnessed as an act of mercy. B was on the floor picking up glass. Her face was bright red. Everyone looked away. The man next to me put down his book. He walked to the counter, not quickly, not with the energy of performance, just quietly and without any fuss, and he got down on the floor next to B and started picking up pieces of glass with her. She said something to him, presumably the thing you say to a stranger who is unexpectedly helping you, which is probably some version of you don't have to do that. He said something back. She laughed briefly in the middle of her embarrassment. They cleaned it up together. He handed her the collected glass. He said something else. She smiled, genuinely this time. He went back to his table and his tea and his book without looking around to see if anyone had noticed. He picked up exactly where he had left off. He was on the page where he had laughed. I want to be very honest about this moment and what happened in me during it, because it would be easy to make it romantic, and that is not exactly what it was. What it was that I saw something. I saw a man who did a kind thing without needing anyone to see him do it, who noticed someone's embarrassment and moved toward it instead of away, who was so unconcerned with how it looked that he just did it, and then returned immediately to his book, in the same way you return to a book after getting a glass of water. The kindness was just what was happening next. It was not a performance, it was just him. I don't know how to explain what that does to a person who grew up in a house where nothing happened without the calculation of how it would appear. I don't know how to explain what it is to witness uncomplicated goodness after years of being trained to look for the string attached to every act of warmth. What I can tell you is that I looked at this man reading his book with the tear in his elbow, and something in me said, "Oh, that's what it looks like when it's just real." I did not speak to him that day. I want to be clear about that because otherwise this becomes a different story, a story about romantic bravery which it is not. I watched him finish his tea, mark his page, put on his jacket over the elbow tier and leave. That was it. I didn't know his name. I went to my meeting. But I thought about him that evening. And the next day. Not obsessively, I want to be precise here, because obsession was one of the things I had learned to distinguish from genuine feeling. It was more like a thought that came back to me the way a song comes back when you've heard a few bars of it somewhere. A gentle recurrence. A sense of having seen something I would recognize if I saw it again. I went back to the coffee shop the following Tuesday. I told myself I was going because the coffee was good, which was not true. The coffee there was fine and the coffee at the place next to my office was better. I sat at the same table. I worked. He was not there. I went back the Tuesday after that. He was there. Same table, same jacket, different book, tea. He did not do anything remarkable that day. He just read, I just worked, we did not speak. At some point I refilled my coffee, and on the way back to my table I knocked my bag off my chair with my elbow and several things fell out, including a pen, my phone, and a very old receipt I had been using as a bookmark, and I made the usual chaotic sound of someone trying to collect scattered things while also holding a full cup of coffee. He was on the floor next to me before I registered that he had moved. He picked up the pen, the phone, he looked at the receipt. It had a sentence written on it in my handwriting because I write sentences on receipts constantly. It is a habit I have had since I was 15 and needed to write things down before they slipped away, and by now it is simply reflex. The sentence, because I want you to know it, was, "The thing about hope is it keeps showing up even when you've been very rude to it." He read it, he looked up at me. "Is that yours?" he said, and he meant the sentence, not the receipt. "Yes," I said. He handed it back. "It's good." "Thank you," I said. We went back to our respective tables. I realize this sounds like very little. I realize the romantic comedies have trained us to expect the dramatic meet cute, the spilled coffee that leads to an exchange of numbers, the charged first conversation where every line is a sign. What I am telling you is that it was not that. What it was smaller, and in being smaller, more real. Two people in the same coffee shop every Tuesday. Two people who had noticed each other and were, slowly and without agenda, existing in each other's peripheral vision. Two people who were, in their separate and invisible ways, in the middle of becoming something. The first real conversation happened 3 weeks later, which was a Tuesday in late April, when the coffee shop had opened its sidewalk seating for the first time since winter, and the afternoon had the particular golden quality of spring air doing its best after a long, hard cold. And I was sitting outside with my notebook, not working but staring at the street the way you stare at streets, when you're trying to find the sentence that will unlock the scene you've been stuck in for 2 weeks. He came out and sat 2 tables down. "Are you stuck on something?" he said. I looked at him. "Sorry." "You keep looking at the street like it owes you something," he said. I looked back at the street. "I'm stuck on a scene." "What's it about?" "A woman who is trying to convince herself that the thing that happened to her was her fault when it wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. "What's making her stick to that story?" "She's been holding it for a long time," I said. "Letting go of it would mean letting go of the explanation, and without the explanation, she'd have to find something else to believe about herself." Another quiet moment. Then, "That's a good reason to get unstuck." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm stuck." He smiled. It was a very good smile, the kind that starts in the eyes and takes a moment to get to the mouth. "I'm Daniel," he said. "Nora," I said. We talked for 2 hours. I did not notice the time passing, which is the truest measure I have of a conversation, when the time doesn't feel like time, when it feels instead like something else entirely, like the specific quality of being in a space that has the right dimensions for you. He asked about the writing and listened to the answers without waiting for his turn to speak. He told me he was an architect, which surprised me because I had imagined him as something quieter, a librarian, a translator, and then he explained that the architecture he did was mostly restoration work, old buildings being brought back to what they were before time and neglect had gotten to them, and I thought, of course. "What do you do with the parts that can't be restored?" I asked. "You work with them," he said. "You make them part of the new structure, you don't hide them. A building that pretends to be undamaged is less interesting than one that's honest about what it's been through." I wrote that down later. Not to use it, I wouldn't do that without permission, just to hold it for a minute. We exchanged numbers, and it was not romantic in the electric sense. It was practical, the way you exchange numbers with a person you've been talking to for 2 hours and would like to talk to again. He texted me that evening, a single message that said, "Good luck with the stuck scene." And then, 15 minutes later, "Did you figure it out?" And then, "Sorry, I realized that might be annoying." I texted back, "It's not annoying, and not yet." He texted, "You will." The certainty in it, the complete absence of qualification. I held my phone in the dark of my apartment, and I thought about the way he had said it, not "I think you will," or "I'm sure you will," or any of the phrasing that softens an assurance into something more careful. Just, "You will," like he had looked at the fact of me for 2 hours and arrived at a conclusion that required no hedging. I wrote the scene the next morning. We had coffee again the following Tuesday, and then dinner the week after that, and I want to tell you about those early months the way they actually were, which was careful and slow and full of the particular nervousness of two people who are both, in their different ways, carrying things. I learned his things gradually, The way you learn a new landscape, not by studying a map but by moving through it and letting the hills and valleys reveal themselves as you walk. Daniel's mother, Dorothy, was alive and fierce and lived 40 minutes away, and his relationship with her was the kind of relationship that makes you understand what a good parent actually is, not a perfect one, but a present one, a person who had stayed and kept staying and had told him, as a consistent practice of daily life rather than a dramatic declaration, that he mattered. His father had died when Daniel was 12, which was the wound underneath everything, the loss that had shaped the particular quality of his attention, the way he looked at people as if trying to memorize them, as if losing them had taught him not to take presents for granted. He had been in one serious relationship before, a woman named Adele with whom he had spent 4 years, and with whom things had ended without malice, and with the specific kind of mutual sorrow that comes from two good people discovering they are not good together. He didn't speak about Adele often or with bitterness, which told me more about him than almost anything else. He read constantly. He cooked badly but with enthusiasm. He had a dog named Fred, a large orange creature of indeterminate breed who was devoted to Daniel with a simplicity that I found both hilarious and deeply moving. He was not a man who needed to fill silence. He could sit with you in quiet without fidgeting, without performing ease, just quietly there the way good company is there. He was funny in the dry, precise way that requires you to pay attention to catch it, and it rewarded you when you did. He was also, and this is the part I want to tell you carefully, because it was both the most healing and the most frightening part, extraordinarily good at seeing me. Not in the Philip way where being seen was an instrument of control, not in the way that means someone is cataloguing your vulnerabilities, in a different way, a way that felt more like, I see you accurately, which means I see both the strength and the damage, and I am not frightened by either of them, and I am not going to exploit the damage to manage the strength. The first time he called me out, I was 4 months into knowing him. We were at dinner, an actual dinner at a restaurant, not coffee, which felt significant, and he had said something that had made me genuinely happy, and I had done the thing. The automatic, reflexive thing, the self-diminishing thing. I had deflected the happiness away with a joke, pointed it outward, redirected the warmth before it could land anywhere real in me. He looked at me for a moment. "Can I say something?" he said. "Yes," I said. "You just did a thing," he said. "You've done it a few times. Something good happens, something feels good, and then immediately you sort of move away from it, like you don't trust it to stay if you look directly at it." The silence was very long. "That was extremely observant of me to notice," he said with perfect timing, and I laughed in spite of myself, and then I looked at him and said, "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone paying attention," he said, "and I'm paying attention." I looked down at my menu. "I'm working on it," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying it as a criticism, I'm saying it because I want you to know you can look at it directly, the good stuff." He paused. "With me at least, you can look at it directly with me, I'll still be here." I did not cry, which was an act of extraordinary willpower, and I also did not deflect, which was an act of something harder and braver than I had a word for yet. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said. And we ordered dinner, and it was the best dinner I can remember, and not because of the food. I need to tell you about the first time he met my parents, because it is important, and because it went almost exactly as badly as I expected, and because the way he responded to it was the moment I began to understand that something was happening that I was not equipped by my history to recognize and would have to learn to live in. I had told him about my parents gradually, over the months of our early friendship and the beginning of our relationship. Not everything, not the specifics of every small wound, because some things are still yours even when you share them, but enough for him to understand the shape of things. He had listened with the particular quality of attention he brought to everything, which was steady and unflappable, which did not mean impassive. He felt things, I knew by then how much he felt things, but which meant he could hold what you gave him without dropping it or needing to fix it immediately. We had been together 8 months when they came to visit. My parents visited the city periodically, a duty call to their daughter who had moved away, and I always found the visits exhausting in the way of something that has grown over you so slowly you can only feel its weight when you try to move. I had told them about Daniel. My mother had said, "That's wonderful, Nora," in the tone that meant she was reserving judgment. My father had said, "What does he do?" And when I said architect, he had said, "That's stable," which was the highest praise in Howard Calloway's register. We met for dinner at a restaurant I had chosen carefully, not too expensive, which would make my father suspicious, not too casual, which would make my mother nervous, middle of the road in all the ways that meeting your partner's parents for the first time requires when the parents are not easy. Daniel wore a jacket without a tear in it. He held the door. He shook my father's hand and said hello to my mother, and he looked perfectly, quietly comfortable, which I was not. I watched my parents meet him with the specific hypervigilance of someone who grew up reading the air of a room for signs of danger. I watched my mother take him in with the rapid, invisible inventory she performed on all new people. I watched my father assess and classify, and arrive, within the first 10 minutes, at the conclusion that Daniel was a reasonable person, which was his highest category. The dinner was fine. It was almost entirely fine. There were no dramatic moments. My parents were on their best behavior, which was a behavior that involved being polite and asking appropriate questions, and not doing any of the specific things that had marked my childhood as marked. They were like the most civilized possible version of themselves, which is how people often are when they know they're being observed by someone new, someone who might draw conclusions. The moment came over dessert. I don't remember exactly how it started. A conversation about my writing, I think, or about my plans, and my mother had said something about my tendency to get ahead of myself, which was a phrase she used for my enthusiasm, the way you might use a phrase for a habit someone has that you find mildly irritating but have learned to live with. And then she had said, gently, with the gentleness that was her preferred instrument, that she hoped the writing was going well, but that it was always important to have other options, just in case things didn't work out the way I hoped. Nora tends to put all her eggs in one basket, she said to Daniel, with the warmth of a woman sharing a fond but rueful truth about someone she loves. Daniel looked at my mother for a moment. Then he said, I've read 3 of Nora's stories. She's a remarkable writer. I don't think just in case is a framework that applies to her. The table was quiet. My father looked at Daniel. My mother looked at Daniel. I looked at Daniel. We just want her to be realistic, my father said, and his voice had the careful neutrality of a man who is not accustomed to being contradicted at a table. I understand that, Daniel said pleasantly and without a single degree of backing down. I just want her to be believed in. I think those are different things. The rest of dessert was quiet. My parents left shortly after, and on the sidewalk my mother kissed my cheek and said it had been lovely to meet Daniel, and my father shook his hand again, and they walked to their car. I stood on the sidewalk watching them go, and I felt something very old and very tired in me, the specific tiredness of a person who has been managing other people's discomfort for as long as they can remember. Daniel put his arm around me. You okay? He said. I don't know what I am, I said. That's okay, he said. You don't have to know right now. We stood on the sidewalk in the April dark, and I leaned into him, and I let the tiredness be there without managing it, and I let his arm be there without deflecting it, and for the first time in a very long time, I was in a moment without being already halfway out of it. He asked me to marry him on a Wednesday, which is statistically the least romantic day of the week, in the kitchen of his apartment while we were making pasta, and Fred was sitting on the kitchen floor watching us with the interested attention of a creature who has learned that kitchens produce things worth waiting for. There was sauce on my shirt. He had already burned the garlic once and started over. I want to tell you about the 10 minutes before he said my name, because those 10 minutes are also part of the proposal, in the way that the weather before a storm is also part of the storm. We had been talking about the novel. I had sent him the first full draft 3 weeks earlier, which was the most frightening thing I had done in my adult life, not the submitting to literary journals, not the facing of Philip, not the therapy, not even the walking out of doors. Handing him those pages was different. Those pages were the truest thing I had ever made. They were the journals sublimated into fiction, the childhood and the car and the back seat and Mrs. Aldridge and the earthworms, and everything I had felt and not been allowed to feel, shaped into a story that was mine in a way nothing else was quite mine. And I had given them to him. He had read them in 2 sittings. He had texted me after the first, I'm halfway through, I need to finish before I say anything. Just Nora, the unfinished sentence. I had held my phone and not known what to do with the feeling of being read that carefully by someone who already knew me, and finding that the reading did not make him go away. After the second sitting he had called and we had talked for 2 hours, and he had spoken about specific pages, specific paragraphs, specific sentences, the way he spoke about buildings he had worked on with precision and love, with the respect of someone who understands what went into a thing and honors the going in. He did not say it was brilliant. He said, "It's you, all of it is you, and it is very, very good." And I had received it, I had not deflected. I had held on to it with both hands. So when he said my name in the kitchen 3 weeks later, I was already in the middle of being more myself than I had ever been in anyone's presence, which is maybe the best thing to be in the middle of when someone is about to ask to spend their life with you. He said, "Nora." I said, "The garlic is going to burn again." He said, "I need to ask you something before I ask you to watch the garlic." I turned around from the stove. He was holding a ring, which was an heirloom, his grandmother's, a small oval setting in gold that had been chosen by a woman who had lived in another century, but had clearly understood that the best jewelry does not shout. He was looking at me in the way he had looked at me for a year and a half, which was the way that had never stopped being the thing I described to myself, privately, as accurately. He was seeing me accurately. "I know what you've been told," he said, "about yourself, about whether you're someone worth choosing. I know you've been carrying that for a long time, and I know it doesn't just go away because someone says it's wrong. But I want to be the thing you bump into every day that reminds you it's wrong. I want to be the evidence. I want to spend my life being your evidence." He stopped. Then, "Will you marry me?" The garlic burned. We didn't care. I said yes, and I meant it with my whole body, with every part of me that had ever been told it wasn't worth saying yes to. With the 7-year-old on the kitchen floor and the 9-year-old in the back seat and the 15-year-old in the passenger seat, and the 23-year-old in the master's program and the 25-year-old on the apartment floor, I said yes for all of them on behalf of all of them, and I held onto the ring and the man and I let it land. I looked at it directly. I did not deflect. Fred put his paw on my foot, which I am choosing to interpret as congratulations. Telling my parents was a conversation I had over the phone, which was a choice I made deliberately. My mother said, "Well, that's quite fast." My father said, "Has he met a lawyer about a prenuptial?" I said, "Dad." He said, "I'm just being practical." I said, "I know." Then my mother said something that I want to tell you, because it is part of the story and it needs to be. She said, "I hope you know what you're doing, Nora." And I said, with a steadiness I had worked very hard for, "I do, I finally do." There was a pause. Then very quietly, in a voice that was different from her usual voice, smaller, less certain, as though something had given way briefly in the architecture of her, she said, "I just don't want you to get hurt." I held the phone for a moment. "I know, Mom," I said, "I know you don't." And I did know. In the way that you can know something and have it be simultaneously true and insufficient, she did not want me to get hurt. She had spent 22 years telling me I was unlovable as a form of preemptive protection, which is perhaps the saddest and most human logic I have ever encountered. Hurt yourself by hearing it from us now, before the world can hurt you with it later. Make yourself small enough to fit in the spaces where disappointment lives. Don't want the thing, so you don't have to feel the loss when the thing turns out to be right. She was wrong and she loved me, and she had no idea how to do both of those things at the same time, and she was my mother, and I was getting married, and she was going to be there. Penny was my maid of honor, obviously, because Penny had been my maid of honor in every situation that required someone to stand next to me for 20 years, whether or not the ceremony was literal. She cried when I called her, immediately and without shame, and then she said, "Can I make the playlist?" And I said yes. The playlist was magnificent. The wedding planning itself was, like most wedding planning, a medium-grade emotional experience, involving opinions about flowers that nobody thought they had until suddenly everyone had them, and the discovery that the world contains more varieties of white than any person should be expected to distinguish between. Daniel was patient through all of it. He cared about very little, the music, the food, that Fred would be allowed at the venue, and deferred on almost everything else with the genuine equanimity of a person who has correctly identified that the wedding is one day, and the marriage is the rest of your life. The venue was a restored barn on the edge of a valley 2 hours outside the city. This was Daniel's only strong preference, which made sense when he explained it. It was a building he had helped restore 6 years earlier, one of his early projects, a structure that had been in bad shape and had been brought back, and he wanted to get married in a place that had been repaired. I want to be married somewhere that knows something about being fixed, he said, and I said, God, you're annoying. And he laughed and kissed me and we booked the barn. We wrote our own vows. I want to tell you about the vows, because the vows are the heart of this story. They are the moment this story has been building toward from the very first page, but first I need to tell you about the morning of the wedding, because the morning matters. I woke up at 5:30. The venue had a small cottage where the bridal party had stayed the night before, and Penny had been asleep since midnight and would not wake for another 2 hours. I put on a robe and took a cup of tea from the kitchen and walked out to the porch and looked at the valley in the early light, which was grey and silver and very still, the kind of still that feels like the world is holding its breath. I thought about the word brave. Penny had used it the night before at the rehearsal dinner, in the toast she gave that had everyone half crying and half laughing and fully certain that she was the best human being any of us knew. She had talked about knowing me for 20 years, about the earthworms and the back seat and the notebooks and every inch of the road that had led to this barn, and she had said at the end, looking directly at me, I want to say something about Nora that she probably won't say about herself. She is the bravest person I know, not because she never got scared, because she got scared and did the thing anyway. She was terrified to be loved truly, wholly, without conditions, and she did it anyway. She stood in the fire of being seen and she didn't run. She paused. And I think that's the most important kind of brave there is. I had done the thing I always did. I had made a joke, deflected it a little, smiled too wide. But I had heard it. I had held it. And standing on the porch in the early light I was holding it still, turning it over, trying it on. Brave. I thought about my parents. They were in a bed and breakfast 15 minutes up the road, and they were coming to my wedding today. They were coming to the barn, to the building that had been repaired. They would sit in the 3rd row. I had told my mother gently when she asked about seating that the first 2 rows were reserved for the immediate family of the bride, which I said was the wedding party, and she had said, of course, with the careful dignity of a woman who knows she is being placed and has decided not to say so. 3rd row on the bride's side. I thought about everything they had told me. I thought about the car and the orange juice and the back seat and the stage and every dinner and every phone call, and the particular accumulated weight of being someone's child and also, in some essential way, someone's failure, or, more precisely, someone's reminder of their own failure, which is a different and more complicated burden. I thought about what Daniel had said, I want to be your evidence. And I thought about the child in the back seat of the car, looking at the streetlights going past, deciding the problem was her. I thought about her very carefully. I thought about what she deserved to know. She deserved to know that she was not the problem. She deserved to know that the woman sitting on the porch of a barn in Tennessee in the early morning grey, about to marry a man who looked at her accurately and was not frightened by what he saw, that woman was her. She grew up to be that woman. She grew up. I drank my tea and watched the valley come into the light, and I let myself feel the full weight of the morning. I did not deflect it. I looked at it directly. Penny found me there at 7:30 with a cup of coffee and a look on her face that was trying to contain about 11 different things at once. How are you? She said. I'm actually okay, I said. She sat down next to me. Yeah. Yes, I looked at the valley. I'm really genuinely actually okay. She put her head on my shoulder for a moment. We sat there in the morning quiet and then she said, You know what I've been thinking about? What? That earthworm thing you did when you were 8, the arranging them on the porch. I laughed. What? Why? Because you were trying to thank them, she said. You were a little kid and you read something about earthworms and you wanted to thank them. That's who you are, Nora. That's always been who you are. And today someone is going to stand up in front of everyone and say that out loud and She stopped. Her voice had gone a little uneven. I'm just really glad I got to see it. I held her hand. Me too, I said, me too. I need to tell you what Daniel wore. He wore a suit he had bought with Dorothy on a trip into the city 3 weeks before the wedding, navy blue, with a tie the colour of old copper, and Dorothy had told me separately that he had tried on 11 suits and chosen the one that looked the most like himself, which struck me as the only correct criterion for a wedding suit. He was standing at the altar when I came down the aisle, and I want to be honest about what it was like to walk down that aisle, because it was not the thing movies have prepared you for. It was not the thing where you see each other and everything else disappears in a romantic blur. It was almost the opposite. It was the thing where everything else sharpened. The candlelight sharpened, the faces of the people I loved sharpened, the barn itself sharpened the old wood. The repaired beams, the places where new work had been done around the old damage, exactly as Daniel had said it should be. I saw Penny in the front row, already crying. I saw Dorothy with her eyes closed. I saw in the third row my mother and my father, sitting with the stiff, careful posture of two people who had come a long way to be somewhere they hadn't expected to end up. I saw Daniel. He looked at me with that look, the accurate look, and he smiled, the slow one, the eyes first, and I thought very clearly and without poetry, this is the right thing, not because the barn was beautiful and the flowers were right and Penny had made a magnificent playlist, because of how it felt to be seen by him and not be frightened of it, because of how it felt to have my own life feel like mine. I walked down the aisle, I took his hands. The ceremony was conducted by a friend of Daniel's named Reverend Osai, a man of such calm and generous presence that I had liked him immediately and loved him within the hour, who had known Daniel for years and who had agreed when we asked, to let the vows be the center of things. The vows are where it is, he had said, which was all I needed to hear. I said mine first. I had written them over the course of 3 weeks and revised them 20 times, and the version I read had been finalized the night before. I will not reproduce them here in full because some things are meant for the room they are spoken in, but I will tell you that I said this. I spent a long time learning how to be alone with myself before I could learn how to be with you. I want you to know that I brought all of it, all of me. The difficult parts and the parts I'm still working on, the writing and the earthworms and the back seat of the car. I brought all of it because you told me you wanted all of it, and for the first time in my life I believed someone when they said that. That is what you have given me. Not the love, though I take the love, I take it whole and without reserve, but the believing. I will believe in you the way you have believed in me. Every day, without qualification, without condition. That is my vow. Several people were crying. Penny was making no attempt to contain herself. Dorothy had opened her eyes and was looking at her son with an expression that contained the whole of her 31 years of knowing him. In the third row, my mother's hands were tightly folded on her lap. Then it was Daniel's turn. He took a folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of his navy suit. He unfolded it. He looked at it for a moment and then he looked at me and then he looked at the paper again and he said, I wrote this 3 times. The first time was too long. The second time was too careful. The third time I just wrote what was true. He began to read. The first time I saw Nora, she was sitting in a coffee shop trying to get something out of a street she was staring at. I didn't know what she was trying to get, but she looked like someone who needed it and I thought, that's a person who takes things seriously, who feels things, who is looking for the exact right thing and won't settle for less than the exact right thing. I didn't speak to her that day. The second time I saw her, she had a receipt in her bag with a sentence written on it, and the sentence was about hope, and the way she wrote it, I want you to know that I have read a great many books, and that sentence on a receipt in a coffee shop stopped me. Not because it was clever, because it was true, because it had been written by someone who had thought carefully and honestly about what hope actually is, and had written it down on a receipt because you take what you can get. I fell in love with Nora slowly and then completely, the way you fall asleep gradually, and then all at once. I fell in love with the way she listens. I fell in love with the way she writes. I fell in love with the way she talks to children, as if everything they say is worth hearing, because she knows what it means to have the things you say treated like they're not. I fell in love with the way she argues, which is honestly and without cruelty. I fell in love with the way she reads out loud sometimes, when something is very good, not for me but for herself, because she can't contain it. I fell in love with her difficulty. I want to say that clearly because I know that word has been used against her. Nora is difficult in the way that things that are real and true and complicated are difficult. She requires attention. She requires you to mean what you say and say what you mean. She requires you to show up. These are requirements I am grateful for because they have made me a better person, a more present person, a person who does not drift through his own life half awake. She has made me pay attention. I know what she's been told. I know the story she was given, the story that said she was too much and not enough, that she was the kind of person who would always be wanting and never quite managing to have. I know she has been carrying that story for a long time. I want to stand here today in front of everyone she loves and everyone who loves her, and I want to say out loud and on record, that story is wrong. That story was written by people who did not know how to see her. That story was a map of their own limitations, and it was given to her as if it were a map of herself. Nora, You are not difficult. You are specific. You do not want too much. You want exactly as much as you should want. You are not the kind of person no one will choose. You are the kind of person I choose every day with every piece of information I have, with clear eyes and full knowledge of everything you are. The best day of my life was the day you let yourself believe me. He looked up from the paper. He looked at me. And then, because he was Daniel, he looked at the 200 people in the room and he said simply, "That's it, that's all I had." The silence lasted for approximately 3 seconds. Then it broke, in the way that silences in rooms full of people break when something true has happened, into the sound of 200 people exhaling at the same time, and then crying, and then laughing at themselves for crying. And Penny had both hands over her face and Reverend Osai was smiling with his whole body, and Dorothy had her hands flat on her knees and her head slightly bowed. And I was standing at the altar with my hands in Daniel's hands, looking at the man who had just said those words out loud, in front of everyone on the record. And then I heard a sound from the 3rd row. I looked. My mother's handbag had fallen off her lap. It was on the floor. Her hands were in her lap now empty, and she was looking at me in a way I had never in 28 years seen her look at me. Not with the assessment, not with the management, not with the gentle redirection. She was looking at me with an expression that was cracked open, the way a face looks when something has gotten through a wall that has been standing for a very long time. And what had gotten through, I knew it, I felt it. I understood it with the full and complicated knowledge of a daughter who has loved her parents imperfectly and been loved by them imperfectly, and has somehow, against the odds, arrived at a morning and a barn and a husband. What had gotten through was the truth. Not my truth, the larger truth, the truth that Daniel had said out loud. My father had unfolded his arms. He was sitting with his hands on his knees, and he was looking at his daughter at the altar, and I watched something move across his face, something slow and complicated and not entirely comfortable, the way emotions move across the faces of people who have very little practice letting them. He was not crying. Howard Calloway would not cry at a wedding, not in public, not where it could be seen, but he was something. He was some version of himself that was not the version that sat in the car with the phone and skimmed over you. He was looking at me. I held Daniel's hands. I let myself be in the room fully, without reservation, without the half-step backward that had been my instinct for 20 years. I let the barn and the candles and the people and my husband and the moment all be real at the same time. I let the 7-year-old and the 15-year-old and the woman at the coffee shop with the receipt all be here with me. I did not deflect it. I did not manage it. I looked at it directly. Reverend Osai said, "I believe we have rings." The reception was the best party I have ever been at, which is a sentence I recognize is exactly what people say about their own receptions, but which I also mean factually. Because Penny's playlist was extraordinary, and the food was exceptional, and Daniel danced with an enthusiasm that bore no relationship to skill, and which I found unbearably endearing, and Fred, who was in attendance on a leash held by Daniel's cousin, managed to steal a piece of bread from the appetizer table, and was entirely unrepentant about it. There was a moment about an hour in when I looked up from a conversation and saw my mother standing near the edge of the room, and she was watching the dancing with an expression I did not know how to categorize. Not distant, not managed, something more open than that. I excused myself and walked over to her. She saw me coming. She straightened slightly, that old posture, the armor of it, and then something in her shoulders came down a little, just a little. "Are you enjoying yourself?" I asked. "Yes," she said then, "it's a beautiful wedding, Nora." "Thank you." Quiet for a moment, the music played, people danced. "His vows were," she started and then stopped. "Yeah," I said. She looked at me, and this is the part I want to remember exactly as it was, without making it larger or smaller than it was, without the temptation to resolve it more fully than it resolved. She looked at me and said, in a voice that was the quietest voice I had ever heard from her, "I know I didn't always." She stopped again. "I know," I said. "I was afraid," she said. "I was always afraid you would be hurt, and I think she pressed her lips together, "I think I may have gone about that the wrong way." I thought about Patricia on the phone. I thought about a woman who had been told she was too much, who had become very still as a result, who had passed the stillness on to her daughter as if it were a kindness. I thought about the receipt and the sentence about hope. I thought about everything. I know you were afraid, I said. He loves you very much, she said, and she said it with a kind of wondering disbelief, as if she was reporting something she had not expected to find true, and I thought about everything that was in that sentence, the disbelief, and underneath the disbelief something else, something that looked almost like relief. He does, I said. She looked at the dance floor where Daniel was teaching his cousin a step incorrectly and doing it with great confidence. Then she looked back at me. I'm sorry, Nora, she said. 3 words, in her voice, said plainly, without performance, without qualification. I don't know what it cost her. I don't know what years of that particular silence had built up to require this moment to release. I only know that when she said it, I felt something in me that had been braced for a very long time slowly stop bracing. I know, I said. I hugged her. She was stiff for a moment, her old self, the armored self, and then she was not. She held on. She held on the way you hold on to something when you've realized you came very close to losing it and are only now, perhaps too late and perhaps not, beginning to understand what it was. My father appeared at her shoulder because he had been watching from a few steps away in the careful way he moved through emotional situations, tangential and observing. He looked at me. He looked at me with the clear eyes he had had at the altar, the unfolded arms. Your husband is not a bad dancer, he said. Which from Howard Calloway was several things at once. It was an exit from the conversation. It was a deflection from whatever he was feeling. It was also, knowing him as I did, knowing the full and complicated truth of him as I now did, it was also his version of what my mother had said, his version of I'm sorry, his version of he loves you, his version of I see you, I saw you up there, I was there. He's terrible, I said. He knows all the steps in the wrong order. My father almost smiled. That does seem like him, he said. I laughed, my mother laughed. My father's almost smile became a real one briefly, the way something breaks the surface of water and then goes back under, but you know it was there. It was not a resolution. I want to be clear about that because easy resolutions are dishonest, and I have promised you honesty from the beginning. My parents did not change because of a wedding and a set of vows. My mother did not become a different kind of mother in an evening. My father did not suddenly become fluent in warmth. What happened was smaller and more important than that. What happened was the beginning of something. The first real conversation in a language we had never quite shared before. The first acknowledgement, imperfect, incomplete but real, that something had been wrong, and that they knew it, and that they had been at the barn to see what had grown from the wrong place despite them. Small gestures. I told you at the beginning that this is a story about small gestures. The man helping Bea with the broken glass on a Tuesday morning, the hand on Nora's shoulder on a sidewalk in April, the receipt with the sentence about hope, the half a sandwich and the you don't have to be fine, the 7 words from a mother at the edge of a dance floor at a barn wedding in Tennessee. Small gestures, the ones that don't look like the story while you're in them, and then turn out when you look back to be the whole thing. I want to tell you what happened after. Not to tie it up with a ribbon, because life is not a ribbon and I've been honest with you this far, but because you've been here for the whole story and you deserve to know what the whole story is. Daniel and I have been married for 2 years now. We live in a house that is, as you might expect, being gradually and lovingly restored. He does the structural work, I do the filling in, which is not a metaphor but works as one. Fred has an entire couch he has decided is his, and we have officially surrendered it. I finished my novel. I am writing this. Penny is in our lives in the consistent, unglamorous, essential way she has always been. The texts at 11 p.m. when one of us is in our head, the Sunday dinners, the playlist she updates every season. Dorothy comes for dinner on the first Sunday of every month, and she and I talk about books, and she feeds Fred things from the table that she pretends she doesn't feed him. She is the kind of mother-in-law who exists in this story, as evidence that parents can be present in the specific way mine were not, and I love her for it, the way you love someone for showing you something possible. My parents and I are, for the first time in my life, something that resembles honest with each other. It is not easy. It does not look like warmth in the movies. It is a thing of small, consistent increments, a phone call where my mother asks about the book without qualifying it, a dinner where my father listens to something I'm excited about without reaching for his phone. Small windows, small rooms letting in air. We are not there yet wherever there is. But we are on the way to something that neither of us had, 2 years ago, believed possible. My parents and I are, for the first time in my life, something that resembles honest with each other. It is not easy. It does not look like warmth in the movies. It is a thing of small, consistent increments, a phone call where my mother asks about the book without qualifying it, a dinner where my father listens to something I'm excited about without reaching for his phone. Small windows, small rooms letting in air. We are not there yet wherever there is. But we are on the way to something that neither of us had, 2 years ago, believed possible. There was a moment about 6 months after the wedding when my mother called me on a Wednesday evening, which was not a day she usually called. I answered expecting something practical, a question about the holidays, an update about a neighbor, and instead she said without preamble, "I've been thinking about what Daniel said at the wedding." I sat down. "Okay," I said. "About the story," she said. "He said it was a map of our limitations, that we gave you a map of our limitations and you thought it was a map of yourself." She paused. "I've been thinking about that." "And," I said, careful as someone approaching a thing made of glass. "And I think he was right," she said. "I think he was describing something true." I held the phone very gently. Outside my window, it was raining in the particular soft way it rains in early autumn, and I thought about the valley and the barn and the silver-grey light of the morning before my wedding, and I thought about the 7-year-old sitting on the kitchen floor and the long road from there to here. "Thank you for saying that, Mom," I said. "I'm not good at this," she said, which was the truest thing she had ever said to me. "I know," I said, "neither am I." "You're better than I was," she said, "at your age." I didn't know what to say to that. So I said I had help. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "Yes," she said, "you did." They came to Daniel's birthday last spring. My mother helped in the kitchen without being asked, which she had never done before. My father and Daniel talked for 40 minutes about a restoration project Daniel was working on, and my father asked questions that suggested he had been paying attention to what Daniel did, had learned it, had found it interesting. And I watched them from across the room and thought about things built back from damage, about new work done around old places, about what a building looks like when it is honest about what it has been through. My mother cornered me in the kitchen while we were doing dishes. She said, "You seem happy." Not a question, a statement, said with the careful wonder of someone who has not quite believed until this moment in the truth of the thing. "I am," I said. "Good," she said, and she turned back to the dishes, and there was nothing more to say, and the nothing was the right size. I have been asked since the wedding why I invited them. Friends who knew the full history, who had watched me rebuild myself in the years before Daniel, who understood what 22 years of being told you were unlovable does to the architecture of a person. Friends have asked me gently why I invited them to witness something they had worked so hard to make me believe would never happen. I have thought about this careful,